Hi everybody, welcome back to the 10th of an hour with Griffin Bridgers. For today's episode 88, we're going to look at unnecessary quote-unquote QTIP elections. In particular, we're going to look at how those are treated under Revenue Procedure 2016-49 and what options that might give to a surviving spouse. Now, as we're going to see, the QTIP election is an important part of overall estate tax planning and can give some relief even for poorly drafted documents in order to zero out estate tax liability. But traditionally, overuse of it could have created some sort of wasting of an estate tax exclusion. And while that's no longer as much the case, we're still going to look at situations in which this might be a necessary avenue of relief for a surviving spouse. Now, as always, this presentation is not intended to substitute for legal or tax advice. So in general, for any transfer to a U.S. citizen spouse, if it's a lifetime transfer, the donor receives a marital deduction against gift tax. And if it's a transfer at death, the decedent or the decedent's estate would receive a marital deduction against estate tax. So in essence, transfers that are in a qualifying form to a U.S. citizen spouse are not subject to any form of transfer tax. Now, where the QTIP election comes into play is in what I mentioned as a qualifying form. I won't dig into the terminable interest rules, but generally if you have a trust, which is essentially a life estate equivalent for the sole benefit of a beneficiary spouse, then the marital deduction becomes elective, and it requires that a qualified terminable interest property or QTIP election be made on the Form 709 for gifts or Form 706 for transfers at death. Now, when I say QTIP, I'm not referring to the cotton swab you put in your ear. This is an election to apply the marital deduction to assets that are transferred for the benefit of a surviving spouse in a life estate equivalent form. Now, one problem with the marital deduction is that it's not an estate tax avoidance technique, it's simply an estate tax deferral technique. So what happens is that any assets over which the QTIP election has been made will be included in the surviving spouse's gross estate at their date of death fair market value. So this isn't a perfect solution, it's really just a deferral of estate taxes. Now, prior to what was known as the portability election, a problem with the marital deduction and the QTIP election in general is that when overused, it could cause a wasting of the donor spouse's or deceased spouse's basic exclusion amount, which is now a whopping $11.58 million and will increase to $11.7 million in 2021. Now, prior to 2010, any portion of that wasn't used by a deceased spouse was forever lost, but part of the Tax Act in 2010 included what's colloquially known as a portability election, which allows the deceased spouse's unused estate tax exclusion to be preserved for the surviving spouse. Now, before portability, there was a revenue procedure, Proc 2001-38, which recognized that any assets over which the QTIP election were made would be included in the surviving spouse's gross estate, and it gave that surviving spouse relief from a tax planning perspective to void an unnecessary QTIP election. So what was unnecessary? In that case, it was really an election that exceeded what was necessary to lead to a zeroing out of the estate tax liability. So in other words, it was a situation where there was a wasting of the deceased spouse's basic exclusion amount. So prior to the portability election, it often made sense to structure an estate plan that first funded a credit shelter trust or a Clayton QTIP trust, and in either case, those types of trust wouldn't necessarily treat the spouse as the sole beneficiary, and those types of trusts would use the exclusion of the first spouse to die from both an estate tax and a GST tax perspective, instead of using the exclusions of the surviving beneficiary spouse. Now, post-portability, a more popular estate planning technique has become funding first a marital trust, which is eligible for the QTIP election. And the reason this makes sense is because post-portability, you have 3 outs that allow you to zero out the estate tax, but maybe preserve the unused exclusion. One is that you could just simply fully fund the marital trust, make a full QTIP election, and then also make this DeSuey election, the portability, to preserve the deceased spouse's unused exclusion. Now, one problem is that that portability election applies only to the estate tax exclusion that's unused and doesn't apply to the GST tax exclusion. So no matter what, the portability election still cannot preserve the GST tax unused exclusion. So if you want to preserve GST tax exclusion, you might have to look to one of these other 2 outs that you might have. So one would be a disclaimer by the surviving spouse. The surviving spouse could disclaim assets maybe onto the children or maybe to an optional credit shelter trust over which the spouse could be a beneficiary but couldn't hold a power to appoint in excess of an ascertainable standard. And in that case, the deceased spouse's unused estate and GST tax exclusions could be applied to that credit shelter trust. And a third out could be a partial QTIP election, which could simply hold non-elected assets which wouldn't use the marital deduction in the marital trust, or it could send them on to an optional credit shelter trust known as a Clayton QTIP trust. And in either case, those non-elected assets could use the deceased spouse's unused estate and GST tax exclusions. So post-portability, this is kind of the most flexible tax planning structure for an estate plan, but it still hasn't fully eliminated the possibility that there's an unnecessary QTIP election in the grand scheme of things that exceeds what's necessary to zero out the estate tax on the deceased spouse's estate. So what has now replaced that old revenue procedure I mentioned is Rev Proc 2016-49, which is more of a post-portability revenue procedure, which still allows for avoiding of the unnecessary QTIP election. But there's a couple tickets to entry. One, there has to have been no portability election made or contemplated. And the spouse has to take action by filing or coordinating a supplemental 706 or 709, and that has to be made within the limitations period for the estate tax return, the Form 706. Now, this relief is not available in a situation where there is a partial QTIP election, and it doesn't matter how that's made. It could be by formula to reduce the estate tax to 0 for the deceased spouse's estate, or it could be by a non-formula which applies to more assets than are necessary to reduce the estate tax to 0. So in the case of a partial QTIP election, this isn't an option that the surviving spouse has, but in the case of a full QTIP election, it's still an option as it might have been before. And where you might want to look at this is in a situation where there's a wasting of the deceased spouse's unused GST tax exclusion. Now, even where the QTIP election is made, there can be what's known as a reverse QTIP election for GST tax purposes, which would still allow the deceased spouse's GST exclusion to apply to the marital trust, even though that marital trust will ultimately be included in the surviving spouse's gross estate. I mentioned that a few episodes ago when we talked about the GST tax exclusion allocation and how there's an estate tax inclusion period, or ETIP, which would usually prevent the allocation of GST exemption. But with the reverse QTIP election, that would not be the case. Now, one area this revenue procedure doesn't address is whether the reverse QTIP election would be affected by a spouse's voiding of the normal QTIP election, and most likely it would not, even though not directly stated in the Rev Proc, because the reverse QTIP election already treated the donor or deceased spouse as the transferor for GST tax purposes, and voiding the actual QTIP election would just simply unify the the donor or the decedent as the transferor for all purposes, both for GST tax purposes and for gift and estate tax purposes. So that's probably why that wasn't mentioned, and that's also pretty good authority, I think, to rely on to say that there's no effect on the reverse QTIP election if there's a voiding of the actual marital deduction QTIP election. As always, if you have questions or topic suggestions, you can email those to me at griffin.bridgers@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to this episode of The 10th of an Hour, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.